Imagine you open your eyes to the sound of servants quietly preparing your bath. Warm water, scented oils, a freshly killed goose waiting for your breakfast. Outside, your vineyard stretches as far as the eye can see. And somewhere in the distance, a man you own is weeding it. That is more or less what it felt like to be rich in the ancient world. But here's the thing, it wasn't just luxury, it was a completely different relationship with existence itself. Being wealthy in antiquity meant something profoundly different from what it means today. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about power, performance, fear, and the constant, exhausting theater of being seen. For a wealthy Roman senator in, say, 100 AD, the day began early, not because he had to, but because power in Rome was transactional, social, and relentless. Every morning, hundreds of clients, people who depended on his political favor, would line up outside his home before dawn. This ritual was called the salutatio. It was essentially a morning audience, like a very small king holding court while still in his robe. The senator would walk through this crowd of anxious, flattering humans, granting requests, making promises, dispensing small gifts called sportuli, little baskets of food or coins, and generally enjoying the spectacle of people being very, very nice to him. This happened every single morning, and if you were rich enough, your crowd could number in the thousands. Think about that for a second. Every morning, thousands of people showing up to your house, just to be in your presence. Today we call that a follower count. In Rome, they called it influence. Meanwhile, his wife, if she came from a wealthy family herself, was undergoing her own ritual. Hair was architecture in Roman aristocracy. A skilled ornatrix, a specialized female slave dedicated entirely to hair and makeup, could spend hours constructing the elaborate curled and pinned towers that fashion demanded. Pliny the Elder complained bitterly about the time women spent on their appearance. Pliny the Elder also wrote 37 volumes of natural history in his spare time, so perhaps he had opinions about how other people used their mornings. Rich Egyptian nobles in the New Kingdom had a similarly theatrical morning. Makeup was not vanity, it was spiritual protection. The kohl around their eyes wasn't just cosmetic, it was believed to ward off the evil eye, infections, and the general malice of the universe. So putting on your face in ancient Egypt was technically a religious act, which means spending 45 minutes in front of a mirror every morning was not self-indulgence, it was piety. Egyptians were ahead of their time in many ways. Wealthy Mesopotamians in Babylon had their own morning obligations. A rich merchant or palace official would begin his day with a prayer, not a private, quiet murmur, but a formal, structured invocation directed at a personal god. Every wealthy Babylonian had one, a personal deity assigned specifically to you and your household, whose full-time job was to advocate for your interests in the divine bureaucracy. If things were going badly, it was probably because your personal god had stepped away from his desk. The solution? More offerings, more rituals, more expense. Being rich in ancient Babylon meant maintaining a relationship with your own private god, which is either the most ancient form of networking ever recorded or the most expensive subscription service in history. The homes of the ancient wealthy were not just places to sleep. They were statements, arguments made in stone about who you were, how much you mattered, and how thoroughly everyone else should respect you. A wealthy Roman's domus was designed with this purpose explicitly in mind. You entered through a narrow corridor that opened dramatically into an atrium. A large central hall with a rectangular pool in the floor called the impluvium, opened to the sky above. Light flooded in from above. The pool reflected it. Everything was orchestrated to make your jaw drop at precisely the right moment. Beyond the atrium was the tablinum, the master's office and reception room, where business was conducted and visitors were received. Then came the garden, the peristyle, surrounded by columns filled with fountains and sculptures and plants arranged with obsessive precision. And surrounding all of this were the dining rooms, the libraries, the private baths, the kitchens, and the dozens of small, windowless, stuffy cells where the slaves slept. That last detail tends to get glossed over in travel brochures about Pompeii. The The homes of wealthy Greeks, particularly in Athens during its golden age, were more restrained on the outside. Deliberately so. Ostentation on the street was considered vulgar and socially dangerous. You didn't want to look too rich from the outside. But step through the door and the interior courtyard was a different world entirely. Shaded, cool, decorated with fine pottery and bronze work, designed around the private pleasures of the family. Mesopotamian elites, particularly in Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar II, lived in multi-story mud brick palaces with private water systems, cooling towers, and roof gardens. The so-called hanging gardens, whether they existed exactly as described or not, are a reflection of an actual culture of elite landscaping that was absolutely real. Rich Babylonians had gardens, carefully irrigated, artificially constructed gardens in a dry climate. Because if you have enough slaves and enough engineering knowledge, you can make water go uphill. And if you can make water go uphill, you will absolutely do it, just to prove that you can. The decorative details inside these homes were where the real money went. Roman walls were covered in elaborate painted frescoes, not just pretty pictures, but entire mythological narratives. Trompe-l'oeil architecture designed to make rooms look larger, and detailed landscape paintings called topia that depicted idealized garden scenes. If you could afford it, the walls of your house depicted a better world. A world of perpetual summer, architectural perfection, and gods lounging around doing interesting things. The message was clear: the man who lives here has transcended the ordinary. He doesn't just inhabit the world, he curates it. Egyptian elite homes were similarly precise in their decoration. Painted ceilings mimicked the night sky. Floors in wealthy Amarna villas were decorated with naturalistic paintings of plants and animals that made you feel like you were walking through a garden even when you weren't. The ancient wealthy understood something fundamental. Your environment shapes your psychology. And if you have enough money, you can engineer your environment to tell you, every single day, that you are exceptional. Food in the ancient world was the clearest possible signal of status, and the wealthy did not waste the opportunity. A Roman banquet, the cena, was not a meal. It was a performance. Guests reclined on couches arranged in groups of 3 around low tables. You didn't sit at dinner if you were important. Sitting was for servants and people who ate standing in the street. Reclining meant you had arrived, literally and figuratively. The food itself was designed to impress through rarity, complexity, and deliberate excess. The cookbook attributed to Apicius, the great Roman culinary collection, describes dishes of brain-stuffed dormice, flamingo tongue sauce, fattened snails fed on milk until they were too fat to retreat into their shells, and sea urchins served in garum, the ubiquitous Roman fish sauce that apparently went on absolutely everything, including, one suspects, other fish sauce. One of the most famous ancient dinner parties we know about was thrown by Trimalchio, a fictional nouveau riche freedman in Petronius's Satyricon. It's a satire, but it's rooted in real social behavior. At Trimalchio's feast, dishes arrive in increasingly absurd theatrical packaging. A roast pig is cut open to reveal sausages and blood puddings inside. Mechanical contraptions lower dishes from the ceiling. Zodiac signs are carved into the food. At one point, Trimalchio pretends to die so his guests can rehearse the funeral. This is a comedy, but it's a comedy written by a man who had been to enough real Roman banquets to know exactly what was being mocked. Wine at these events deserves its own chapter. Roman elites aged their wine, labeled it by vintage and vineyard, and developed what can only be described as a snobbery that would feel entirely familiar to anyone who has ever sat through a wine-pairing dinner. The best wines, Falernian, Cacuban, Massic, could cost extraordinary sums and were served at specific points in the meal. Cheaper wines were diluted with water and given to lower-ranked guests. The wine you received at a Roman dinner party was a precise indication of exactly how important your host thought you were. One ancient source mentions a host who served 3 different qualities of wine to 3 different tiers of guests at the same table. The guests at the bottom tier noticed. They always notice. In ancient Egypt, wealthy tombs were decorated with detailed depictions of food, not just to show what the deceased had enjoyed in life, but to magically provide it in the afterlife. The walls of elite tombs are essentially very expensive restaurant menus. Roasted oxen, piles of bread in dozens of varieties, figs, pomegranates, beer in amphorae stacked ceiling high. The ancient Egyptian wealthy were not particularly subtle about the fact that one of their primary concerns for this life and the next was making sure the good food kept coming. Wealthy Athenians had their own food culture, centered around the symposium. Not a conference, as the word now implies, but a drinking party of extraordinary sophistication. After the meal, tables were cleared, wine was mixed in large craters according to a ratio debated and decided by the group, and the serious business of the evening began: philosophical debate, poetry recitation, music, and games. The Cuttabos was a popular symposium game in which participants flung the dregs of their wine cups at a target across the room. We know this because the archaeological evidence for it is abundant, which means that at the height of Athenian intellectual civilization, the men who funded the Parthenon spent their evenings drinking wine and throwing the leftovers at each other. History contains multitudes. Entertainment was not passive. It was participatory, physical, and often extremely, extremely bloody. The Roman elite did not merely watch gladiatorial combat, they hosted it. A private munus, a gladiatorial show sponsored by a wealthy individual, was one of the primary mechanisms through which Roman aristocrats performed their status and purchased the loyalty of the public. The more lavish the show, the more beasts, the more gladiators, the more spectacular the deaths, the more political capital you accumulated. Julius Caesar, before he became Julius Caesar, nearly bankrupted himself funding gladiatorial games. His father had left him a collection of 320 pairs of gladiators in silver armor. 320 pairs. That was an inheritance. The venatio, wild animal hunts staged in arenas, were another form of elite entertainment that required extraordinary logistics. Exotic animals had to be captured in Africa or Asia, transported alive across the Mediterranean, kept fed and healthy enough to perform, and then released into an arena to fight hunters or each other. The supply chains required to produce a single afternoon of Roman entertainment in the late Republic would be considered ambitious logistics by modern standards. Wealthy Romans funded these spectacles and got their names inscribed on monuments for it. The transaction was explicit. You spend money, the public cheers, the public votes for you, you get power, you spend more money. Round and round it went, and the lions kept dying, and the crowds kept coming. Wealthy Greeks, particularly in Athens, sponsored theatrical festivals. The great tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus and the comedies of Aristophanes were not just art. They were funded by rich citizens called chorigoi, who competed for the honor of sponsoring the most elaborate, best-performed play. Being the chorigos whose play won the Dionysia festival was a serious source of social prestige. Athens essentially crowdfunded high art through elite competition, which is a business model that honestly deserves more credit. Private entertainment at home was equally elaborate. Roman dinner parties routinely featured recitations of poetry, performances by musicians, acrobats, dwarves, and yes, dwarves were a specific status symbol in Rome, because keeping one as part of your household staff was a thing people did. Magicians and professional storytellers. The wealthy of antiquity seem to have had a deep horror of silence. Every moment of leisure had to be filled with stimulation, which is either very relatable or very alarming depending on your perspective. Chariot racing deserves mention here because it illustrates something important about how ancient entertainment and ancient wealth intersected. The great racing factions of Rome, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, were funded by wealthy patrons and had the kind of devoted fan bases that modern football clubs can only dream about. The Circus Maximus could hold 250,000 spectators. Successful charioteers were the ancient equivalent of modern sports celebrities, adored by the public, lavishly rewarded, and used as instruments of political branding by the men who paid for their horses. A famous charioteer named Gaius Apuleius Diocles reportedly earned the equivalent of $5 billion over his career. His patron was very pleased with this return on investment. Being rich in antiquity meant your body was a project, and that project required an army. Roman baths, the thermae, were public. But the truly wealthy had private baths in their homes. Multiple rooms, cold pool, warm room, hot room, massage room, depilation by specialist slaves, perfumed oils applied after bathing, hair treatment, nail care. All of it performed on your body by other humans whose entire existence was organized around the maintenance of yours. The strigil deserves a moment here. This was a curved metal scraping tool used after exercise to remove the mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt from the skin. Athletes and wealthy Romans would have this done to them by slaves after their workouts. The scrapings, the grime mixed with oil from a famous athlete's body, were actually sold in small flasks as a kind of ancient celebrity merch. People bought the sweat residue of famous gladiators and athletes and rubbed it on themselves. Whether this was for beauty, luck, or just the ancient equivalent of buying a signed jersey is unclear. Probably all three. Wealthy women in Rome had access to face creams made from barley flour, eggs, ground antler, and narcissus bulbs. There were face masks made from crocodile dung. Yes, really, Galen recommended it. And preparations made from crushed pearls dissolved in vinegar. Cleopatra is famously said to have bathed in donkey milk for her skin, which would have required the daily milking of somewhere between 200 and 700 donkeys. Egyptian records suggest she actually traveled with her own herd, which is one of those facts about ancient history that just sits with you for a while. The wealthy also used their bodies differently in public. Posture, gait, the way you wore your toga, the slowness with which you moved, all of this communicated status. Rich Romans were known for walking slowly and deliberately. Rushing was for people who had places they needed to be. If you had arrived, you moved like you had nowhere you needed to go because your entire point was simply to be witnessed existing. The toga itself, that unwieldy 6-meter woolen semicircle that had to be folded and draped just so, was essentially wearable proof that you had people to help you get dressed in the morning. Nobody could put on a toga alone. The garment was architecturally dependent on assistance, which was, of course, entirely the point. Here is something that tends to get lost in all the luxury. Being rich in the ancient world was terrifying, not in the way that poverty was terrifying. That was a different and more immediate terror. But wealth in antiquity was acutely, structurally unstable. There was no limited liability, no bankruptcy protection, no diversified portfolio managed by professionals. If your ships sank, you were ruined. If you fell out of political favor, your property could be confiscated. If the emperor decided he liked your house was gone. If you died intestate in Rome, your entire estate could dissolve into legal chaos. The wealthy of antiquity were extremely aware of how quickly everything could disappear. This is partly why they were so obsessed with display. Every banquet, every gift to clients, every sponsored game, every marble column, it wasn't just vanity, it was insurance. It was the constant purchase and maintenance of loyalty, patronage networks, political alliances, and social goodwill that might, just might, protect you when things went wrong. The Roman writer Seneca, who was himself extraordinarily wealthy and spent considerable time writing philosophical essays about why wealth didn't matter, noted with some irony that the rich were often the most anxious people he knew. They had more to lose. And they knew it. The Stoic philosophy that was so fashionable among Roman elites was, in part, a psychological technology for managing the specific stress of having everything in a world where everything could be taken. Wealthy ancient Egyptians dealt with this anxiety by essentially spending their entire adult lives preparing for death. Building your tomb, stocking it, hiring priests to maintain the mortuary cult that would sustain your spirit after death. This was not morbidity. It was estate planning. The most important asset you owned in ancient Egypt was not your house or your land or your gold. It was your relationship with the afterlife administrators. Getting the bureaucracy of death right was the whole project, and if you were very, very wealthy, you could afford a lot of bureaucracy. The tomb of Rameses II cost the equivalent of what some modern nations spend on infrastructure. He started building it the moment he took the throne. He reigned for 67 years. He was still adding to it when he died at 90. The fear of social decline was perhaps the deepest anxiety of all. Roman aristocrats had a near-pathological obsession with maintaining their rank. A senator who lost his fortune didn't just lose money, he lost his seat, his clients, his mourning crowd, his social identity. The Latin word for reputation, fama, was understood not as something you built, but as something you maintained, constantly, at tremendous effort and expense. Let it slip for a season, and it might never come back. The wealthy of antiquity didn't relax. They performed relaxation, which is different. We cannot spend this much time talking about ancient wealth without talking about the thing that made it possible. Every bath drawn, every meal prepared, every toga cleaned, every garden weeded, every message carried, every piece of furniture moved, every hair pinned, every oil lamp refilled. In an elite Roman or Greek household, all of it was done by enslaved people. The ratio in wealthy Roman homes could be extraordinary. Pliny the Elder mentions a man named Caecilius Isidorus, who, despite losing much of his fortune, still left 4,116 slaves in his will. 4,116 people, listed as property, in a document about the disposal of property. The psychological dimension of this is almost impossible to fully process from where we sit. The wealthy of antiquity did not experience their slaves as people in the way we would now recognize. They were property with personalities, sometimes beloved, sometimes brutalized, almost always invisible in the historical record, except when they were mentioned as assets. The entire architecture of ancient luxury, physical, social, psychological, was built on a foundation of enforced human labor at a scale that makes it impossible to fully romanticize what life at the top actually meant. The paradox is that many of the most educated, skilled, and intellectually influential people in ancient Rome were slaves. Greek slaves were particularly prized as tutors, secretaries, doctors, and philosophers. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus was a slave. The man who tutored the children of the Roman aristocracy, who shaped their minds and values, was often a man who was owned. Some slaves accumulated enough money through their peculium, a personal fund they were allowed to maintain, to eventually purchase their freedom. A freed slave in Rome occupied a peculiar social position. Technically free, practically connected to their former master through bonds of obligation that lasted a lifetime. The ancient world had many categories of not quite free, arranged in a hierarchy almost as elaborate as the hierarchy of the free. Beyond the spectacle, beyond the food and the baths and the mourning crowds, there was one thing that ancient wealth bought which doesn't fit neatly into any category: time. Not leisure exactly. The wealthy of antiquity were not idle. They were busy in ways that would exhaust a modern executive, but they controlled their time in a way that almost no one else did. A wealthy Roman could spend an entire afternoon reading, or arguing philosophy with friends, or walking around his estate inspecting his vineyards and thinking about absolutely nothing in particular. The ancient world had no concept of productivity in the modern sense. There was no hustle culture. There was no optimization. There was, for those who could afford it, simply the extraordinary luxury of existing on your own. Schedule. This is what the Greek concept of skol pointed toward, the word from which we get school, which tells you something about how Greeks understood the relationship between free time and intellectual life. Skole was not laziness. It was the condition of possibility for everything the wealthy Greek considered important: philosophy, art, politics, friendship, athletic excellence. You needed free time to be fully human in the Greek sense, and free time was something only money could purchase. Everyone else was working. Being rich in the ancient world was, by any measurable standard, extraordinary. It was beautiful and violent and fragrant and anxious and deeply structurally dependent on the suffering of people whose names history mostly never bothered to record. It was also, in its strange and specific way, a form of life so total, so all-encompassing, so theatrically committed to its own performance, that it makes modern wealth look almost understated. Almost. Just with better baths.